most difficult things was villagers with deformed children would, as troop convoys came by, they would take their deformed children and throw them under the wheels of trucks so they can get reparations. Every time there was death to either a farm animal or a child or a civilian, they would come to our local battalion station and ask for reparations. Children under 5, there was a certain price for them. Children between 6 and 14, working class, quotes children, extracted a much higher price. Children between about 16 and 24 extracted the most. Above 24, reparations began to decrease. Women were paid for less than men. But the most expense was for the water buffalo. A water buffalo got $700, while a child under 5 got about $50. I graduated from medical school in 1964 from Georgetown University School of Medicine in Washington, D.C. The most important thing about graduation was that I married my wife, Carol, the day after medical school. We then went off to California, to Los Angeles, to start my internship at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center. During the end of my first year as an intern, the chief of medicine thought that I should go back to NIH for some advanced training after my first year of residency because he thought that I had the potential to be involved in basic research as a career. So I did my internship and started my first year of medical residency, applied to NIH, received a grant and an acceptance in a laboratory of Dr. Jack Orloff there at NIH. With that information, I sent that to my draft board, showing them that I would be doing research for the government for the next 2 years in an established laboratory. My draft board, which was in Philadelphia, my original home, responded by sending me my draft notice. I told them they couldn't do that because I was going to serve the government in a research capacity. They asked me what was my CORD deferment, which was the Public Health Service Deferment Program, which I did not realize I had to apply for separately from my research position in the laboratory. Hence, instead of going to NIH, I was drafted by the Navy and assigned to the Marines right in the middle of my first year of medical residency that I had to leave. And my first assignment was Camp Pendleton, California, which is a Marine base and near Richard Nixon's summer home in San Clemente. My time, the assignment was Field Medical Service School. Field Medical Service School was basic training for physicians and dentists. After 6 weeks in basic training, I learned that in 2 weeks I was shipping out to Vietnam with a newly formed Marine Infantry Battalion with my assignment as the battalion surgeon. One has to understand that the battalion surgeon is the lowest rank possible for a physician in the military. I was then sent to Vietnam with 2nd Battalion, 26 Marines, being shipped out on the USS Bexar. And it's named after Bexar County, B-E-X-A-R, county in Texas. And I was the battalion surgeon for this newly formed battalion. I spent 1 month crossing the Pacific and the South China Sea into Vietnam with some interesting experiences, actually, even on board the ship at the time. Probably the most interesting experience was, in order to help pass the time, they decided to have a boxing tournament. And they asked people, would they sign up for boxing? They would not let an officer fight an enlisted man. And no officer would agree to fight me. So I wound up being the referee for the boxing match. The one thing that shows that the military shines in its anti-discrimination policies at the time, well before the country, and this was in the 60s, well before the country was really integrated, the military was integrated. And I remember seeing my colleagues who happened to be African Americans, and they were your colleagues, and color disappeared as a factor. And I have one picture of 2 soldiers, a black and a white, black and Caucasian, playing checkers, and their hands were just about touching. And it was the touching of the hands that really made me think how society can touch each other. And I thought that was a valuable lesson. I remember I could see it work successfully in the military, and it can work successfully throughout society if given the opportunity. An interesting experience when we landed in Vietnam and landed in Da Nang Harbor. And at 3 o'clock in the morning, there was revelry. And then as we were getting dressed, 3 o'clock in the morning, over the loudspeaker system came the booming voice of the battalion commander. He said, "Men, we're going into combat. Many of you will not come home, but you know you have died fighting and defending democracy for your country." At which point in time I began to shake. By 6 o'clock in the morning, we came topside. It was August 1966, and the temperature at 6 o'clock in the morning must have been close to 100 degrees. Now, we were in full battle gear. Long sleeve shirts, a 60-pound field pack on my back with an entrenching tool, and my weapon, which was a .45, which was, quotes, my issue. You have to understand the .45 in combat is good for only one thing, and that's blowing your own brains out, because it's totally inaccurate after about 10 yards. They lined up all the troops, and they stood there in formation, and then began to faint because of the heat and wearing such heavy clothes with full gear and a helmet on. Finally, at about 9 o'clock in the morning, I remember very vividly, we climbed over the side of the boat and down the nets, just like you saw in World War II, into the landing craft. As each landing craft was filled, it pulled away and then began a circle, because they always go into shore in formation. They told everyone, stay below the gunnels. We're going into combat. So I'm lying on the floor of this flat-bottom landing craft that's bouncing around in circles away from the ship once we loaded. The fumes were incredible. I thought I was going to lose it all and vomit all over the place in full combat gear, and as we were circling. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, we said, okay, men, we're going in, and across the harbor we went in formation. I thought I could not survive. I had to get my last breath of fresh air. And I thought once I put my head above the gunnels, I'm sure a bullet would ding me, and that would be the end. And as we're going across the harbor, I looked up to grab my last breath of fresh air, and there was a Seabee who was water skiing. And he said, "Hi guys, welcome to Vietnam." So that was our first thing. We then pulled into a landing area, and they dropped the front loader in the landing craft. And the first Marine ran off and sank in about 10 feet of water. He was too far out. The poor guy almost drowned. They had to extract him. It took 4 people to lift him up, put him in the landing craft. Some guy was standing on a dock about 10 yards away. He said, "Hey guys, why don't you park the boat over here?" So we pulled back, landed at the dock, climbed out of the landing craft, and walked down the end of the pier. At the end of the pier were local Vietnamese selling souvenirs. "Hi Yank, you buy something for the little lady back home?" And then they were selling beer and Coke that was stolen from the Marine supply. They were selling back to us. And that was my introduction into Vietnam, into combat. We then, after my actually touring through an area of Vietnam, of Da Nang, we were in Da Nang, and there's an area called Dog Patch. For those individuals who remember Al Cap's little Abner, who lived in Dog Patch, this resembled and reminded you of Dog Patch, USA. We then made our way about 8 miles southwest of Da Nang out into what was called Charlie Country, which was heavily infested with Viet Cong. There we set up our base camp, which was named Camp Connor. I never forgot, because of a killed Marine from the battalion, from the first stages. We set up our camp there, and I was in charge of setting up the battalion aid station. We did that for about the first week, first several days, establishing the base camp. I then went to the battalion commander and stated I would like to do something for the local villagers in the area. If I was going to be here, I might as well try to help out with any way I could. So he said, with his permission, off I went to the local villages. And I met with the village elders and other people in the villages and told them I would be back each week to hold a clinic to try to provide some medical care for the villagers. First mistake I made. As I started the second week of rotation, after being in country 10 days, obviously the villagers also told the Viet Cong that I was coming at a set time. And I was traveling down a small little dirt road with my one corpsman in the back, a driver, and myself off to the villages. As we hit a certain bend of the road, I happened to take a picture of the countryside. And about 10 seconds later, shots rang out. And the first bullet hit my driver in the shoulder. He slumped over the wheel, which saved our life, because we slid into a ditch and took us out of the direct line of fire below the elephant grass. I then grabbed the M14 rifle that I comshawed, I appropriated, and I rolled out the back of the Jeep, and I told the corpsman to roll out and go around the bend, so in case they happened to mortar us, at least we would not be in a direct line of fire. There was a tree line about 75 meters across a rice paddy, and that's where the fire was coming from. And I asked the corpsman to fire bullets from left to right to a certain sector, and then I went from right to left trying to cover the sector of this tree line. Each of us fired 100 rounds with 5 clips, pulling the rifle above our heads, above the grass, and just firing in a spraying fashion. This was not Rocky, this was not Sylvester Stallone standing up. I was staying below the elephant grass. After what seemed like eternity, but more like about 15 minutes, there was no return fire. It was totally silent. I had to make a decision. Do you get up and drive away, putting yourself in the direct line of fire in case they were lying in wait for you? Or do you clear the tree line first to make sure that it's safe to drive away? I made the decision that we had to clear the tree line before I put before I put my corpsman, the driver, and myself in danger of being shot at again in the open area. So with the fire and cover maneuver, the corpsman and I took about 10-15 minutes to go 75 meters across the rice paddy, taking 2 or 3 steps, hitting and rolling, while one fired 2-3 rounds off. We finally got to the tree line, and there were 2 dead Viet Cong. One had taken a bullet through his neck. The other had taken a bullet right through the center of the forehead. I took what papers we could. I wrapped up my driver's shoulder, put him in the passenger seat, and I drove the Jeep back to camp. First thing I went to was the battalion commander to tell him what happened, what was the incident. As I reported this to him, he looked at me and said, "Ah, damn." But he used a little more direct language than that. He said, "Ah, damn. It took a squid," and a squid was a derogatory term the Marines used for the Navy detachment to them. It took a squid to get the first recorded kill for the battalion. That's what he was most upset about. Not about my life or the life of the corpsman. I then went to my hut and probably shook for 3 days before he came out. When I went back to the villages thereafter, I never announced when I was coming. I still went back, but never announced when I was coming. As you go back into the villages, and there we were fighting for democracy and fighting against communism, what the first thing I learned from the villagers and the village elder, they could have cared less about our presence. They said the ARVNs, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, come into the village during the day and extract their taxes, either in direct payment or in terms of food or animals, chickens, pigs. At night, the Viet Cong came in and did exactly the same thing. They said, "Let me be taxed only one time, not twice." They could have cared less who it was, but let it only be once. That's when I learned our message of defending democracy certainly had not reached the village level. As a physician, we take the oath to try to save lives, not take lives. So I had to reconcile fighting for my own life versus a violation of my Hippocratic oath. But my own life came first. I had to save my own life so I could hopefully save others. But then it made me reflect on the value of war and what we were trying to achieve. And what we were trying to achieve was at some diplomatic level, but it certainly had no impact at ground zero level in the trenches. There was a total disconnect. And that disconnect appeared constantly throughout the year in so many other different vignettes. The longest time I was in any one location was 6 weeks. That was close to when we first were in Da Nang. We were there in our base camp outside of Da Nang. That was about 6 weeks. Then we moved to Phu Bai. That was maybe 50 to 60 miles north to another base camp. And I was in Phu Bai 6 weeks. And then every other stay thereafter was shorter as the Marine Battalion kept on moving around, being called up for another battle and a new front being opened up. When we finally went to Dong Ha, and Dong Ha was the northernmost base camp below the DMZ, below the demilitarized zone, we were being mortared constantly, and we built an underground bunker. So I lived underground for 54 days while we're being mortared, coming up only every once in a while for a breath of fresh air. So that was 54 days of living underground. There was a 19-mile stretch from Phu Bai north towards Dong Ha, towards Dong Ha, a 19-mile stretch along the coast. It was named the Street Without Joy by Bernard Fall a great French author who characterized the French Indochina War better than anyone else through a series of several books he wrote, 2 Vietnams, and one of his books was called The Street Without Joy, because he characterized the combat and the ambushing that went on in this 19-mile stretch of territory along the coast. I say north of Phu. And it was a killing battleground that went on during the entire French Indochina War and continued during our Vietnam War. Bernard Fall came back to Vietnam to recapture or try to capture what was the U.S. position, what was the U.S. doing that was any different or the same as what the French did during the French Indochina War. He, as I said before, I thought was the best historian and the best chronicler of Vietnam, and understood the foibles and the mistakes that the French made during the French Indochina War, and came back and showed that we were doing exactly the same thing that the French had done. We were repeating all the mistakes the French had made. Bernard Fall was assigned to our battalion during his stay when he came back to re-examine the Street Without Joy, because that was our territory. And every night that he was around, I spoke to him constantly. And he was the richest source I've ever met, and a wonderful gentleman who was at this time had relocated to Howard University and was a professor of history at Howard University in Washington, D.C., while being back here, quotes, on sabbatical in Vietnam. One day he was out with the Marines on patrol, and he was the 13th person in line, and 12 Marines in a row stepped over a landmine that he happened to step on, and basically detonated himself, and he died. And the most difficult thing I had to do all year long was to pronounce Bernard Fall dead, after spending many nights with him, trying to get an understanding of Vietnam history, what role it played in our presence there, what was the relationship between Vietnam and China, how did that play out. So he taught me more about the history of the area and the mistakes made by both the French and us in this whole region. So it was the most tragic loss of a great historian, a great novelist, and for me personally, to see someone so knowledgeable be wasted for what? My surgical experience in medical school was during the rotation, in the surgical rotation, was Steinman, pull on the retractor and get your goddamn head out of the wound. So my surgical experience was pulling on a retractor. I had zero idea about surgery. I had no interest in surgery. I was interested in internal medicine, and I was doing a straight internal medicine internship and residency at the time, and therefore had my only surgical exposure was suturing in the emergency room at DC General Hospital. Beyond that, zero surgical experience. But they said, you're the battalion surgeon, you're a surgeon. And so when it came time to get involved in surgery and do surgery when it was necessary, I did it with a surgical textbook, Christopher's Textbook of Surgery. I had the corpsman open it as I was reading it, as I was operating, having no idea what anything looked like. And as I was looking at the book and looking into the wound, I'm saying, geez, this doesn't look like that. But what you remember is that you just tie off as many bleeders as you can. You put in drains as many drains as you can. You give as much fluid as you can. And it's very, very difficult to kill an otherwise healthy Marine. During combat, it was very common for bullet wounds to penetrate the chest cavity. That produced what was called a hemopneumothorax, blood and air into the lung cavity that produced a collapse of the lung, and therefore, if not corrected, would lead to death. You learn from having no surgical experience the necessity of being as rapid as you can placing a chest tube, because it was a life-saving procedure. I probably put in at least 600 chest tubes, and I could do one skin to skin in 30 seconds after what probably the first one took me maybe 10 minutes. So therefore that was a life-saving procedure. The one thing, I did one tracheotomy in Vietnam in the most difficult circumstance. Every time we had a company-sized maneuver from our battalion, a company is 300 men. There are 4 companies in the battalion, so there are 1,200 men in the battalion, approximately, with some support system. The 300 men, anytime there was a company-sized maneuver of 300 men or more, the battalion commander said, "Where my men goes, the doc goes." So anytime we had such a size maneuver, I was out in combat with the Marines, and I was about a quarter of a mile back through a jungle area when I heard gunfire. An ambush had started as the Marines were coming across an open rice paddy area. And after a few minutes, they said, "Get the doc up here quick." So I came running through this jungle path and came right to the clearing, and there was a little flag, maybe 50 meters out. A Marine had taken a bullet through his jaw, and it shattered his jaw and closed off his oropharynx, which is his windpipe, and he was asphyxiating. He was dying right in front of my eyes. So I made my way, again, in a hit, roll, fire and cover maneuver till I got to the rice paddy. And the Marine was in his last stages at the time when I got there. Blue, not being able to breathe. The only thing I had with me was my hunting knife that you call the K-bar. And I always had my K-bar on my hip. And I always kept it razor sharp. And I got to him, and I ripped open his shirt, and I made a vertical incision and then a horizontal incision with the knife. And I used his shirt to stuff into the wound to stop the bleeding, to provide what we call hemostasis. Now remember, this is buffalo dung infested water that I'm laying in. He's laying in a rice paddy in water up to his mid upper chest, and I'm laying next to him doing this procedure. I dissected down to his trachea, got to his trachea, again using the crudest of hemostasis of his shirt. I made a cross stab wound into his trachea. I then took out my ballpoint pen and jammed it into his trachea through this cross incision. I began to breathe for him. He began to pink up as I breathed for him, and he became slightly arousable. But we knew we had to get him out of there as quick as we could. As they called in the helicopter evac, we then loaded the Marine into the helicopter evacuation, and a corpsman and I climbed into the helicopter with the wounded Marine. We were taking turns breathing for him, and there's very light armament in the evac helicopters because they want very rapid liftoff. And as we lifted off and then kind of tilted on the side as we came up like this, small arms fire broke out again. I had just come up from breathing for the Marine. And I was coming up, and then my corpsman was going down to take over for me. In the space of maybe 2 or 3 seconds, bullets came up through the floorboard, hit my corpsman in the spine, and the bullet came right at the top of his head. He died instantly in front of me, as I'm breathing for the Marine. But we were in combat, and I had a life to save with one dead right next to me at a distance of about 1.5 feet. We then went off the coast because one of the hospital ships was on patrol off the coast of Vietnam, and that was one of its stations. We were going to take this Marine to the hospital ship. And as we went out, the pilot said the homing beacon on the hospital ship was down. We knew the general coordinates of the hospital ship, but not an absolute specific location because it was constantly moving. Heavy fog was rolling in, and it was like soup. And we were about 30 feet off the water, staying very low, trying to see where the ship was. We were crossing coordinates and nothing. The pilot said, "We have to turn back. We won't have enough fuel to get back to land if we don't do it now." He said, "I'll make one last pass." So as he turned and made the last pass, I looked out the window, or looked out the open area at the side of the helicopter, and I saw the smokestack from the hospital ship so close, I thought I could reach out and grab it and pull us back. I don't think he missed the smokestack by more than an inch. If he hit that, we would all been dead. And of course he was banking that we missed the smokestack. The pilot turned absolutely white during that period of time. Made a circle and we landed on the helicopter platform on back of the ship. They offloaded the Marine. I stepped out smelling like buffalo dung, just having spent a long period of time in the rice paddy. A kind nurse came up to me. No one else wanted to come close to me. A kind nurse came up to me and said, "Get out of those clothes." And she gave me a scrub suit. She took the clothes off and she said, "We'll wash them." One of the fascinating things that night was I had a chance to call my wife. They had a ham radio operator that patched ham radio operators across the country. So we made contact from someone in California, who then called someone in Washington, who then called Carol, my wife, and that was the first time I spoke to her from Vietnam through a ham radio patch system that night from on board the ship, and told her, I didn't tell her what just had happened. I didn't say that was the worst day of my life, because it was the worst day of my life. But it ended on a happy note, because at least I had a chance to speak to my wife and tell her I was okay at that time. The letters from home were always 2 weeks behind the times. We think in modern day terms of information technology. I wrote a letter to my wife. Maybe it took 10 days, 2 weeks for her to get there, and then back to me. So we're talking about a month turnaround maybe for one letter. During the course of the year, we actually had little dictating machines, and we dictated tapes. I would dictate a tape to her. She would listen to it, then tape over it and dictate back to me. And so we played in our little cassettes. We can hear each other's voices. But again, that was a 2-week hiatus between that which was created and when received. We were up in Dong Ha, and it was after all this mortaring and after I was in combat. And they asked, who will volunteer to go back to Okinawa? So 3 of us raised, they said we need 3 volunteers to go back to Okinawa. So 3 of us, two colleagues and myself, raised our hand. And then they finished the sentence, for jungle warfare training. So I volunteered to go back before I knew what it was for. So I said, so then we went back to Okinawa for a month of jungle warfare training that took us in part of what became a special landing force. A special landing force was designed to either be dropped behind enemy lines and do infiltration work, or to form the first blocking force to stop enemies that were suspected for coming in large forces across, and we were the first. That would be a blocking, and the first combat involvement would be with the Special Landing Force. For those who study the history of Vietnam, the battle for the Khe Sanh Valley in Khe Sanh became the U.S. Dien Bien Phu, which was the fortress that fell that was under French control during the French Indochina War, and that was the downfall of the French and led to the French failure and defeat during the French Indochina War. Khe Sanh fulfilled the exact same role for the U.S. Khe Sanh was in the northwest sector of Vietnam and was the natural entrance point into Vietnam from the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Ho Chi Minh Trail came down out of North Vietnam, swung over into Laos, and then swung back into the northwest sector of Vietnam down through this valley. In April 1967, they had word that a large North Vietnamese army, the North Vietnamese army was not heavily involved in the Vietnam War until that time. Most of it was still being fought by the Viet Cong that really were the local militiamen. And there was some North Vietnamese involvement, but not in a heavy, extensive fashion. So the North Vietnamese army was coming down in its heaviest force through the Khe Sanh Valley. Our battalion, the Special Landing Force, was told to stop them as they came into this area. They name hills by their height in meters. And on the front cover of Life magazine in April 1967, you will see the battle for Hill 881 and 861. That's how tall they were in meters. And that was our battalion stopping the Viet Cong, or stopping the North Vietnamese army as they were coming down. In 4 days, first 4 to 5 days, there remember 1,200 men I told you in the battalion. We took about 300 killed and about 600 wounded, roughly. So we wiped out 3/4 of our battalion in the first 5 days of combat. I had set up a battalion aid station with my colleagues about a mile south of the front lines, if there was such a thing as front lines. I operated, I remember, for 42 straight hours and did 28 OR cases in 42 hours. And again, then evac them back as quick as we could. So how do you operate for 42 straight hours? You go into what's called combat mode. You just don't stop until you really just fall over almost. From November through the end of January was the monsoon season. I do remember it raining for 33 straight days, stopped for 1 day, that rained for about 21 more. And I remember living in mud up to your ankles, mud everywhere you turned. Mud was part of your daily life, whether it be in combat, whether it just be daily living at the base camp, whether you're trying to operate. Mud was everywhere, and it was pervasive, and it was damp and cold, and of course it was a raw, biting cold. Even though it was only in the 50s, it was a raw, damp cold that came right through the bones. One episode, because of the Christmas truce, because this was right during the monsoon season. For those who remember, every year at Christmas time, there was a one-day Christmas truce between the Viet Cong, the Vietnamese, and the U.S., which was kind of ludicrous. They would stop shooting, stop trying to kill each other for 1 day, but every 364 days, we would try to kill each other. However, They violated the Christmas truce, and we violated the Christmas truce. I remember that just before, on Christmas Eve, at the start of the Christmas truce, we were on a large battalion-sized maneuver that we were being moved north just below the DMZ because they were expecting a large infiltration to come over the hills. And we were set up on a plateau trying to block what was thought would be the enemy forces. And this was in December, and it was raining nonstop. And they asked us to dig foxholes. So I was with my two corpsmen and myself, and we tried to dig a foxhole into an area that was a very kind of heavy clay soil. When we realized when we had finished, there was room only for 2 mattresses in the foxhole, not 3. We miscalculated. So we sat down, and one of my corpsmen, fortunately, had filled up his canteen full of scotch, which I'm not too sure where we got it, rather than water. And the 3 of us killed a canteen of scotch on Christmas Eve, 1966. I then told my 2 corpsmen that they were going to be in the foxhole and I would sleep up on top in what was called our rubber ladies. And rubber ladies were inflatable mattresses. So I made the 2 of them get into the foxhole and I stayed on top. But I remember I mentioned this was a clay soil that did not absorb water. And during the night, the foxhole progressively filled up with water. My 2 corpsmen were drunk out of their minds, and they almost drowned in the foxhole. Well, I was up on top while I was soaking wet. At least I wasn't a threat. It was not a threat of drowning for me. Then the next day, we built a battalion aid station. We dug a giant deep hole that was maybe 10, 12 feet deep and about maybe 40, 50 yards long, built into the same soil, which was clay. We put our tent over the top of the battalion aid station, but the water just leaked down the sides, and I remember sleeping there at night in the tent with my hand down and feeling the water rise, turned on a flashlight that was next to me, and everything was floating. All of our battalion gear, medical supplies, were floating across the bottom of this, what was the swimming pool. We clambered out of there, and by morning, this 10-foot dugout for our hospital, quotes the battalion aid station, was now a swimming pool and filled with water. You were given R&R, what was called rest and relaxation. The military used the word, excuse the expression, rape and riot, but it was really rest and relaxation. Carol was in Washington, D.C. when I was in Vietnam, and I had R&R, and I arranged for it in Hong Kong. And Carol flew from Washington, D.C. to Hong Kong, and I then flew from Vietnam to Hong Kong to meet her. And I remember after hugging and embracing her for the first time, she says, "I love you, but you stink," because I still had the rice paddy buffalo tongue wrapped around me. So that was how we first met, and our first child was conceived in Hong Kong. And on his bassinet at Bethesda Naval Hospital, where he was born after I came back from Vietnam, they had a statement, "Made in Hong Kong." That was on his bassinet. Robert Mitchum was there in one of the USO tours. And he was the one who was really interested in seeing the troops and being with the troops. And I spent a day with him flying in helicopters from Phu Bai to Dong Ha and around. We spent an entire day together. And he was as crusty as he was as the characters he played in the movies. He really wanted to give back to the troops in the period of time. That's in contrast to a story about L. Mendel Rivers. the chairman of the House Armed Services Committee from South Carolina. And he was the most powerful man in Congress with regards to the military budget. He came to our battalion on one of those fact-finding tours that you read about constantly in the newspapers. And they lined up the troops from the battalion on a hot September day. And we were in formation a few hours, again when it was extremely hot, overbearing, and very difficult for the troops to stand there. And he was going to review the troops, meet with the battalion, spend time with the Marines. He spent between 30 to 60 seconds max looking at the troops. He went into the battalion commander's tent, and a few minutes later they called me. And I went in and he said, "Where can I get some drinks around here?" And in the battalion aid station was the only place that had a bottle of liquor. So I had to go get the bottle of liquor for L. Mendel Rivers, who turned out subsequently died of cirrhosis several years later. And then he said he wanted to be seen doing something for the villagers. He wanted to give something of meaning to the villagers. And what could I do to facilitate this? Because I had spent most of my time, as much time as anyone else, in the local villages. So we loaded up in the back of a Jeep and a little carriage in back of the Jeep. And we took that which we had the most of, which were wool army blankets. This is 95-degree temperature in September. We took the trailer loaded with blankets and went off to the villages, the local village. I went to speak to the village elder, told him the Great White Father from the U.S. was here to give them a present. And would he line up the villagers? So they lined up people, the elders, lined up the males, and then L. Mendel Rivers was seen being given to each villager a heavy wool army blanket, I say at 95-degree temperature, while his photographer was taking the pictures. The puzzled look on the villager's face, they were astonished. They didn't know what this was all about. They took 2 steps past there. The next Marine took the blankets back and put them back into the trailer in the Jeep. That was my introduction into congressional fact-finding tours. I was really so upset when I saw this travesty, this fiasco that they called a fact-finding mission, that I wrote to my senator from Pennsylvania, where I was officially registered, and that was Joseph Clark. Joseph Clark wrote me back a handwritten note and said, and I just, after describing the L. Mendel River incident, he asked me, "Please do not write to me in the office, write to me at home." And for the year that followed that first letter, or for about the 10 months that followed that first letter, I had an ongoing dialogue with Senator Clark, handwritten correspondence back and forth that I had sent to his home. And therefore, some of the things that I discussed in letters made it into the congressional record. For those who remember history, the first major dove in the U.S. Senate was Ernest Gruening of Alaska. Wayne Morse, second. Joseph Clark from Pennsylvania, third. Those were the 3 major doves in the Senate. That was the first opposition to the Vietnam War in our Congress. When I came back from Vietnam, I had met and had dinner with Senator Clark and discussed the issues. And he said I taught him more about the war than he learned through official channels. The other things about official channels, the negative aspects of the war, was the manufacturing of propaganda. As I mentioned before, my wife Carol was in Washington, D.C. when I was in Vietnam. And occasionally in the Washington Post, she saw an article written about our battalion, about some battle. She sent me those articles to show what was being reported in the Washington Post. And it bore very little relationship to reality. What was reported was purely manufactured and did not reflect what was occurring on the ground. Then I really subsequently learned that all of the publicity, all of the information was laundered through General William Westmoreland's office. And they created the news to fit what they wanted the public to see and not what was really occurring. So our government, or its official organ through General Westmoreland, was really duplicitous. Duplicitous being a really very nice word for lying and for inaccurate reporting and trying to fool the U.S. public about what was really occurring in Vietnam. Our involvement in Vietnam, based on the best reading I could do, was a reflection of the John Foster Dulles, our Secretary of State at the time, on what was called the domino theory. The thought process was that if communism got a hold anywhere in Southeast Asia or in the rest of the world, it would then gobble up one country after another in kind of a domino effect. So our involvement was based on the John Foster Dulles domino theory. Stop communism where it was first beginning to appear, so it would not progress to other countries in the area. If you go back and reflect on that theory from a perspective 40, 50 years later, you realize how fallacious was that theory and has never been proven to be correct. So the lesson is that what our government says is not necessarily correct. In fact, it's frequently wrong, and one has to question our government constantly as to its foreign policy and probably its domestic policy. So the take-home message I came away with is always be a questioning individual, never accepting anything at face value unless you examine it yourself thoroughly. What stays with me most is how fruitless war is. There is no redeeming value to war. War leads to the wasting of young, innocent lives and achieves nothing. If we examine our time in Vietnam, what happened when we were defeated, even though we don't like to say we lost the Vietnam War. Fast forward that to the Gulf Wars, Gulf Wars 1 and 2. Take a look at Iraq now. What did we achieve in Iraq? Where are we now in Afghanistan? And when we leave in 2014, do you think anything will be any different? So it really shows to me the fruitlessness of war, the lack of commitment and willingness to really push diplomacy to the nth degree, and push diplomacy to the nth degree of collegiality and how you work with your colleagues and other nations to promote peace rather than war. That's the largest take-home message. The second message that I've learned is how not to put up with pettiness. There's so much petty nonsense that goes on sometimes in our work lives, and how you do not tolerate that. There's a statement that I made, and you'll excuse the expression, I give no shit and I take no shit, which really means you don't put up with pettiness. It's a waste of your time. The overriding and sustaining feature has been the need to give back. When you see people so less fortunate than yourself, there is a driving force to improve the lives of others above and beyond my role as a physician and our Hippocratic Oath. I felt that serving our community, serving people in need, was a calling that I had to pursue. And as a result, Carol and I have spent much of our adult life post-Vietnam in a volunteer capacity, both within medicine and outside of medicine. And again, to make sure that we can make some tiny, small contribution to improve the lives of others. I believe that that is the best outcome and result. It wasn't planned that way. It wasn't sat down with a specific game plan, but it was an evolution. It evolved into what became our mantra for helping serve others. And I'm really pleased to say to this day, that philosophy, that orientation to help others still exists, and I hopefully will persist until I'm gone.